Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in an argument where you knew you were right, but somehow the other person just wouldn't listen? They kept talking in circles, throwing out claims they couldn't back up, and no matter what facts you presented, they just dug in deeper? Frustrating as hell, right? Well, here's the uncomfortable truth. You've been fighting debates the wrong way your entire life. You've been trying to win by being louder, smarter, or having better facts. But here's what nobody tells you. The most powerful debaters in history didn't win by talking more. They won by asking better questions. And there's one man who perfected this so completely that he became literally unbeatable in arguments. His name was Socrates. And today you're going to learn the exact Socratic method he used to intellectually dominate everyone he encountered without ever raising his voice. Now, before you think this is some boring philosophy lecture, let me be crystal clear about what you're getting here. I'm going to give you 5 questions, just 5, that will systematically dismantle any argument anyone throws at you. These aren't comebacks. These aren't clever retorts. These are psychological weapons disguised as innocent questions, and they work because they force your opponent to defeat themselves. Think about that for a second. You won't have to prove them wrong. They'll prove themselves wrong just by answering your questions. This is the dialectic method that's been hidden in plain sight for over 2,000 years, and most people have no idea it exists. But you're about to become one of the few who does. And trust me, once you master this critical thinking framework, you'll never lose a debate again. Not because you're fighting harder, but because you're fighting smarter. Here's what's going to happen in the next few minutes. I'm going to walk you through each of these 5 questions in detail. I'm going to show you exactly how to deploy them, when to use them, and how to chain them together into what I call the Socratic trap, a sequence so effective that your opponent won't even realize they've been cornered until it's too late. You'll learn the foundation destroyer that exposes weak reasoning, the assumption excavator that reveals hidden biases, the evidence interrogator that separates truth seekers from ego protectors, the perspective shifter that forces intellectual empathy, and the consequent calculator that traces logic to its breaking point. These aren't abstract concepts. These are practical debate strategies you can use today in boardrooms, family dinners, social media arguments, anywhere someone's trying to push a claim they haven't thought through. But here's the catch, and this is important. You need to stick with me until the end of this video because these questions only work when you understand how they fit together. Using them in isolation is like knowing 3 chords on a guitar. You can make some noise, but you're not making music. The real power, the real intellectual dominance, comes from understanding the sequence, the flow, the strategic deployment of each question at exactly the right moment. I'm going to show you that complete system, but only if you commit to watching this all the way through. And look, if you're getting value from this, if you can already see how this is going to change the way you argue and think, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, but it tells YouTube to show this to more people who need to hear it. And if you want more content like this, more philosophical weapons you can actually use in real life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're building a community of people who think deeper, argue better, and refuse to accept shallow thinking. Now, let's get into the first question that Socrates used to destroy every confident claim that came his way. Here's the thing most people don't get about winning debates. It's not about having the best facts. It's about exposing the shaky ground your opponent's standing on. And nothing does that faster than this one simple question. How do you know that's true? See, we live in a world where everyone's got an opinion, and most folks treat their opinions like they're carved in stone. They'll tell you with absolute certainty that something's a fact when really they just saw it on social media or heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. The Socratic method starts here with this foundation destroyer, because Socrates understood something profound. Most people have never actually examined why they believe what they believe. They're walking around with borrowed thoughts, hand-me-down ideas, and they've never once stopped to ask themselves the most important question of all. When you ask someone, how do you know that's true? You're not being confrontational. You're being genuinely curious. That's the beauty of this critical thinking approach. You're not saying they're wrong. You're simply asking them to trace their belief back to its source. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people can't do it. They'll fumble, they'll get defensive, they'll say everyone knows that, or it's just common sense. But common sense isn't evidence, and popular opinion isn't proof. This is the dialectic method in action. You're not attacking the person, you're examining the argument itself. You're peeling back the layers like an onion, and with each layer, you're getting closer to either solid bedrock or empty air. The Socratic Method teaches us that intellectual dominance doesn't come from shouting louder. It comes from questioning deeper. Let me give you a practical example. Someone tells you, social media is destroying our society. Okay, that's a bold claim. Instead of agreeing or disagreeing, you ask, how do you know that's true? They might say, well, studies show. Now you've got something to work with. Which studies? What do they measure? How big was the sample size? Or maybe they say, I just see it happening around me. Perfect. What specifically are you seeing? How do you know social media is the cause and not just correlation? See how this works? You're not being a jerk. You're applying critical thinking to separate assumption from evidence. This isn't some academic exercise, either. This is a persuasion technique that works in boardrooms, family dinners, and late-night arguments with friends. When you master this question, you're essentially asking people to show their cards, and most of the time, they're bluffing without even knowing it. But here's the real power move that most people miss entirely. When you consistently ask, how do you know that's true? You're not just winning debates. You're training yourself to think better. Every time you use this foundation destroyer on someone else, you're subconsciously applying it to your own beliefs. You start catching yourself making claims you can't back up. You begin to notice your own cognitive bias sneaking into conversations. You become more honest, more rigorous, more intellectually humble. That's the paradox of the Socratic Method. The more you use it to question others, the more you question yourself. And that self-questioning, that's what separates the thinkers from the talkers. But foundation-shaking questions are just the beginning, because once you've exposed the cracks in someone's certainty, you need to dig deeper into what's actually holding their argument together in the first place. Every argument, no matter how polished or persuasive, is built on a foundation of assumptions. And most people don't even realize they're making them. They're like invisible pillars holding up a building. Until you point them out, nobody sees them. But once you do, the whole structure starts to wobble. This is where the Assumption Excavator comes in. What assumptions are you making? This question is surgical. It's precise. It forces your opponent to acknowledge the unspoken beliefs they've smuggled into their argument without scrutiny. See, the Socratic Method isn't about memorizing comebacks or clever retorts. It's about systematic deconstruction. You're an archaeologist of ideas, brushing away the dirt to reveal what's really underneath. And 9 times out of 10, what you find underneath is a whole lot of unexamined assumptions that can't stand up to daylight. Let's say someone argues, we need to spend more money on education to improve test scores. Sounds reasonable, right? But what are they assuming? They're assuming that more money equals better results. They're assuming test scores are a valid measure of education quality. They're assuming the current system just needs more resources, not fundamental restructuring. When you ask, what assumptions are you making? You're not disagreeing with their goal. You're questioning their logic. Maybe more funding would help. But maybe the problem isn't money at all. Maybe it's how the money's being spent, or what we're measuring, or the entire philosophy behind modern education. This is the dialectic method at work. You're creating space for deeper examination. You're saying, let's not rush to conclusions. Let's look at what we're taking for granted here. And that's where real intellectual dominance lives. Not in being right, but in being thorough. Here's a personal favorite example of mine. Someone says, people are more divided now than ever before. Okay, let's excavate. What assumptions are you making? Well, they're assuming they have an accurate understanding of ever before, which is a pretty big claim considering human history includes civil wars, religious crusades, and literal witch hunts. They're assuming their perception of current division is objective and not influenced by the fact that they're exposed to more opinions through social media than any generation in history. They're assuming that visible disagreement equals actual division, when really, It might just mean we're finally hearing voices that were always there, but previously silenced. See how this works? You're not saying they're wrong about division existing. You're questioning whether their framework for understanding that division is sound. This is a debate strategy that doesn't require you to be the smartest person in the room, just the most curious one. The beauty of this question is that it works on yourself too. Start asking, what am I assuming here, before you make claims, and watch your thinking sharpen like a blade. You'll catch yourself in logical fallacies you didn't even know you were making. You'll realize how many of your beliefs are built on foundations you've never inspected. And here's the kicker. When you get comfortable acknowledging your own assumptions, you become impossible to rattle in a debate. Why? Because you've already done the hard work of examining your position. You know where it's strong and where it's vulnerable. That's the paradox of intellectual humility. The more willing you are to question your own assumptions, the stronger your arguments become. But assumptions are just one layer of the onion. And if you really want to separate truth seekers from ego protectors, there's another question that cuts even deeper. Topico 3. The Evidence Interrogator. What evidence would change your mind? This question is absolutely ruthless, and I mean that as the highest compliment. What evidence would change your mind is the ultimate BS detector because it separates people who actually care about truth from people who just want to be right. Here's the dirty secret about most debates. They're not really about finding truth at all. They're about defending positions, protecting egos, and performing for an audience. People dig in, not because they're confident in their reasoning, but because admitting they might be wrong feels like death. The Socratic Method cuts through all that theater with this one elegant question. If someone can't name even one piece of evidence that would change their mind, they're not engaging in critical thinking. They're engaging in dogma. And dogma, my friend, is intellectual quicksand. Think about it this way. Let's say you're debating someone about whether remote work is better for productivity. You ask them, what evidence would change your mind? If they're genuinely thinking, they might say, well, if long-term studies showed that productivity consistently dropped by more than 20% across multiple industries, I'd reconsider. That's someone who's open to persuasion techniques rooted in actual data. But if they say, nothing could change my mind, I just know I'm right, or they dodge the question entirely, you've just exposed that their position isn't based on logic, it's based on identity. They've made their belief part of who they are, and now facts are the enemy. This is where cognitive bias shows its ugly face. People would rather be consistently wrong than occasionally uncertain. And this question drags that preference into the light where everyone can see it. The brilliance of this evidence interrogator is that it forces metacognition, thinking about thinking. When you ask someone what would change their mind, you're asking them to imagine being wrong, which is something most people never do. They've never even considered the possibility that their position might not hold up under scrutiny. This is the dialectic method at its finest. You're not telling them they're wrong. You're inviting them to examine the conditions under which they might be wrong. And here's the fascinating part. When people actually engage with this question honestly, they often start to see weaknesses in their own arguments that you never even pointed out. They do your work for you. That's not manipulation. That's guided discovery. You're helping them think more clearly by asking them to define their epistemological boundaries. What counts as evidence for them? What threshold of proof do they require? These are questions that reveal the quality of someone's thinking. Now, here's where this gets really practical for your own intellectual development. Start asking yourself this question about your own beliefs. Pick something you feel strongly about and ask, what evidence would change my mind on this? If you can't answer, that's a red flag. That means you're protecting a belief rather than pursuing truth. And let me tell you, once you develop the habit of constantly asking yourself what would change your mind, you become formidable in arguments. Not because you're stubborn, but because you're flexible. You've already stress-tested your positions. You know exactly where your confidence comes from and what it would take to shift it. That's argument deconstruction applied to yourself first and others second. But identifying whether someone's open to evidence is only part of the battle, because even people who claim to think rationally often can't see past their own perspective. Here's where we separate the amateurs from the masters of the Socratic method. Anyone can attack an argument. That's easy. What's hard, what's truly difficult, is forcing someone to defend their position from the opposing side. What would someone who disagrees say? Is a perspective shifter that does something magical. It makes your opponent argue against themselves. Sounds brutal, right? But it's not cruel, it's compassionate. See, most people have never actually tried to understand the other side. They've constructed a strawman version of opposing views, something weak and stupid that's easy to knock down. When you ask them to articulate what a thoughtful opponent would actually say, you're asking them to engage in intellectual empathy. You're asking them to steelman the opposition instead of strawmanning it. And that's where real critical thinking happens. Let me paint you a picture. Someone's arguing that we should ban all cryptocurrency because it's used for illegal transactions. Fair enough, that's a position. Now you ask, what would someone who disagrees say? If they're being honest, they'd have to acknowledge that someone might point out that regular cash is also used for illegal transactions, that the vast majority of crypto transactions are legitimate, that the technology itself has valuable applications beyond currency, and that banning innovation because of misuse is a dangerous precedent. See what just happened? By forcing them to articulate the other side's best argument, you've made them do the work of seeing their position's weaknesses. This is the dialectic method in its purest form. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You're not ramming a conclusion down their throat. You're guiding them to a more nuanced understanding by making them see both sides clearly. This rhetorical question technique is devastatingly effective because it exposes blind spots people didn't know they had. When someone can't articulate what their opponents would say, it reveals they've never seriously considered opposing viewpoints. They're living in an echo chamber of their own making, surrounded by people who already agree with them. That's not thinking, that's tribal signaling. But when someone can accurately state the opposing view, even if they still disagree with it, you know you're dealing with a serious thinker. That's someone who's done their homework, someone who's wrestled with complexity rather than hiding from it. And here's the beautiful irony. The better you can articulate arguments you disagree with, the stronger your own arguments become. Why? Because you've already anticipated objections. You've already fortified the weak points. You're not just hoping nobody notices the holes in your logic. You've patched them yourself. Now here's where this gets deeply practical for your own life. Start practicing this on yourself. Pick an opinion you hold strongly, and then spend 15 minutes genuinely trying to argue the opposite position as convincingly as possible. Not a weak version, the strongest possible version. You'll be amazed at what you discover. Maybe your position is actually stronger than you thought because it survives serious opposition. Or maybe, and this is where growth happens, you realize your position has weaknesses you never acknowledged. And now you can either strengthen your argument or, heaven forbid, actually change your mind. This is argument deconstruction and persuasion techniques working in tandem. You become more persuasive not by being more dogmatic, but by being more comprehensive. But understanding perspective is only valuable if you can trace those perspectives to their logical endpoints, which is exactly where our next question leads. Most people's arguments collapse under the weight of their own logical implications, and they don't even realize it until you point it out. What are the logical implications? Is the question that forces someone to follow their reasoning all the way to its natural conclusion. And that conclusion is often somewhere they absolutely don't want to go. This is the Socratic method at its most surgical. You're not disagreeing with their premise. You're just asking them to follow their own logic to its endpoint. And here's what's fascinating. People will make claims they haven't thought through. And when you force them to examine where those claims lead, they'll often backtrack faster than you can say cognitive dissonance. That's not you winning. That's them realizing their position was never coherent in the first place. Let's make this concrete with an example. Someone argues, the government should regulate speech to prevent misinformation. Okay, let's calculate the consequences. What are the logical implications of that? Well, who decides what counts as misinformation? The current government? What happens when a different party takes power? Are you comfortable with them having that authority? What about scientific theories that were once considered false but turn out to be true? Would Galileo's heliocentrism have been banned as misinformation? C. The logical implications reveal that the position isn't as simple as it seemed. This is critical thinking in action. You're showing that the path they want to walk leads somewhere dangerous, somewhere they probably didn't intend to go. You're not attacking their values. You're showing them that their proposed solution contradicts those same values. That's intellectual dominance without aggression. Here's where this question becomes a masterclass in logical fallacies and argument deconstruction. When you force people to trace the logical implications of their positions, you expose slippery slopes they didn't see, unintended consequences they never considered, and contradictions they've been harboring without awareness. Someone says, people should be free to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't hurt others. Sounds libertarian and reasonable. But what are the logical implications? Does hurt include emotional hurt? Hurt feelings? Economic hurt from competition? If I start a business that outcompetes yours, am I hurting you? Should that be prevented? Suddenly, a simple principle becomes incredibly complex, and the person who made the claim realizes they need to be way more specific about their terms. That's the beauty of this question. It doesn't just win debates, it elevates them. You're forcing precision where there was previously vagueness. And let's talk about using this on yourself, because that's where the real growth happens. Take any position you hold and ask, what are the logical implications if everyone believed this? If everyone acted on this principle? If you believe hard work always leads to success, what are the implications? That everyone who isn't successful didn't work hard enough? That luck, privilege, and circumstance don't exist? That every wealthy person earned it purely through merit? Suddenly, your simple belief is carrying a lot of baggage you might not want to carry. This is the dialectic method turned inward, using Socratic questioning to refine your own thinking, not just to demolish others. When you master this question, you develop what philosophers call ethical consistency. Your beliefs don't contradict each other because you've traced them to their endpoints and made sure they align. But knowing these 5 questions individually is one thing. Weaponizing them together is something else entirely. All right, here's where everything comes together. And this is where the Socratic method transforms from a philosophical exercise into an unstoppable debate strategy. Each question we've covered is powerful on its own, but when you chain them together strategically, you create what I call the Socratic trap, a sequence of questions that systematically dismantles any argument, no matter how confident your opponent seems at the start. This isn't about being cruel or showing off. It's about intellectual honesty taken to its logical extreme. You're essentially building a maze where every path leads your opponent to either admit uncertainty or reveal inconsistency. And the beauty is, you never had to tell them they were wrong. They discover it themselves through their own answers. That's the ultimate form of persuasion techniques, guided self-realization. Here's how you orchestrate this in real time. Let's say someone makes a bold claim. Cancel culture is destroying free speech. First, you deploy the foundation destroyer. How do you know that's true? They'll likely cite examples of people losing jobs over controversial statements. Good. Now you've got specifics to work with. Next, the Assumption Excavator. What assumptions are you making? Maybe they're assuming that consequences for speech equal destruction of free speech, or that free speech means freedom from consequences rather than freedom from government censorship. Now, they're starting to qualify their original statement. Third move, the Evidence Interrogator. What evidence would change your mind about this? If they can't answer, you've exposed dogma. If they can, you've created openings to explore. See how we're moving through layers? Each question peels back another level of certainty, and your opponent is doing all the work. But we're not done yet. Now you hit them with the perspective shifter. What would someone who disagrees with you say about cancel culture? If they're honest, they'll have to acknowledge that someone might argue these are just social consequences for harmful speech, or that marginalized groups finally have some power to push back against historically dominant voices, or that cancel culture is just a rebranding of age-old social accountability. By articulating the opposing view, they've just weakened their own absolute stance. They've introduced nuance whether they wanted to or not. Finally, you bring in the consequence calculator. What are the logical implications of defining cancel culture as destroying free speech? Does that mean all social consequences for speech are illegitimate? Should employers never be allowed to fire people for what they say? Should there be no social standards whatsoever? The logical implications reveal that their position, when taken seriously, leads to absurdities they don't actually support. This is the dialectic method weaponized for maximum clarity and minimum hostility. You haven't called them stupid. You haven't raised your voice. You've simply asked questions, and through those questions, you've either strengthened their argument by forcing them to refine it, or you've helped them see it was never as solid as they thought. Either outcome is valuable. And here's the real secret that masters of critical thinking understand. When you use this Socratic trap consistently, people stop wanting to debate you with half-baked ideas. They come prepared. They think harder before they speak. You've essentially trained everyone around you to level up their thinking just to keep up with your questions. That's not dominance through force. That's leadership through intellectual rigor. But learning these questions is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when you actually put them into practice in your daily life. So here we are. You now have the exact same weapons that made Socrates untouchable in debates over 2,000 years ago. 5 questions. That's all it takes. How do you know that's true? To destroy weak foundations. What assumptions are you making to excavate hidden biases? What evidence would change your mind to separate dogma from genuine thinking? What would someone who disagrees say to force perspective and empathy? And what are the logical implications to trace arguments to their breaking point? These aren't just debate strategies. They're tools for intellectual honesty, for cutting through the noise, for finding truth in a world that's drowning in opinions masquerading as facts. The Socratic Method isn't about making you obnoxious at dinner parties. It's about making you formidable in your thinking, unshakable in your reasoning, and impossible to manipulate with shallow arguments. But here's the real question, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to watch this video, nod your head, and then go right back to arguing the same old way, getting frustrated, talking louder, hoping you'll somehow convince people through sheer force of repetition? Or are you actually going to practice this? Because let me tell you, knowing these questions and wielding these questions are 2 completely different things. The Socratic Method only becomes powerful when it becomes habitual. You need to start using these questions on yourself first. Examine your own beliefs with the same rigor you'd examine someone else's. Ask yourself what assumptions you're making, what evidence would change your mind, what the logical implications of your positions are. That's where real growth happens. Not in winning arguments with others, but in strengthening your own thinking through relentless self-examination. Here's my challenge to you, and this is where the rubber meets the road. Pick one belief you hold strongly, something you feel absolutely certain about, and run it through all 5 questions. Be honest with yourself. Can you trace it back to solid evidence? What assumptions are you smuggling in? What would genuinely change your mind? Can you articulate the strongest opposing view? Where do the logical implications lead? If your belief survives that gauntlet, congratulations, you've earned your confidence. But if it doesn't, if you find holes you never noticed before, then you've just done something most people never do. You've chosen truth over ego. And that, my friend, is the ultimate form of intellectual dominance. Not dominating others, but dominating your own biases, your own lazy thinking, your own need to be right instead of accurate. Now, if this video gave you something valuable, if you can already feel how this is going to change the way you think and argue, I need you to do something for me. First, smash that like button because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are hungry for this kind of practical philosophy. Second, subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're just getting started. I'm creating more content like this, more weapons from history's greatest thinkers that you can actually use in your daily life. More ways to cut through BS and think clearly in a world that profits from confusion. And third, drop a comment below telling me Which of these 5 questions resonates most with you? Or share a time when you wish you'd had these tools in an argument. I read every comment, and your insights help shape future videos. We're building something here, a community of critical thinkers who refuse to accept shallow answers and demand better from themselves and others. The question is, are you in? Because the world needs more people asking better questions and fewer people shouting louder answers. Let's make that happen together.